Pleasure to welcome to the stage Jhumpa Lahiri, Jonathan Franzen, Crace, Maaza Mengiste, Xioaolu, Chandrahas Chaudhury, and from the British Council, Stephen Roman, to make a brief introduction.
Is this... I'll be going. Leave you two. Okay, thanks. Thank you. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you here on this chilly first morning for the British Council's sessions. We're having 3 sessions today, and I hope we get as good a turnout for the other 2 sessions as we've got here today. I think we all enjoyed the music of Gitu Hinduja. That was really a very nice way to start the morning. The theme of this morning's session is on the global novel. I think that's a big and interesting theme. And as you can see, we've assembled a very impressive group of writers here who will be taking us through and discussing that theme, moderated by Chandrahas Chaudhury. And I'll be introducing them very briefly in a minute. The British Council is proud to have been involved with the Jaipur Literature Festival since it began in 2006, and it's wonderful to see how it's grown into the biggest literary festival in Asia. And in literature, we promote dialogue and exchange between readers and writers and between the UK and the rest of the world. And festivals like this are a great opportunity for us all to get together in this area. In India, we're working specifically through our libraries network, collaborating with educational and cultural institutions, engaging with writers, publishers, producers, translators, and other sector professionals across literature through our programs and collaborations with festivals, book fairs, conferences, and so on, and working within the education system. We have a stand here opposite the Mogul tent, a British Council stand, so do take the opportunity to call there after to find out a little bit more about what we do. We're particularly excited this year because we're hosting the Best of Young British Novelists from the Granta magazine list. And the Best of British Young Novelists is a major programming partnership between the Granta magazine and the British Council. And we're working with international festivals and organizations around the world, including the Jaipur Literature Festival, to introduce the writers and their writing to the rest of the world. And at this year's festival here in Jaipur, we will have specifically Tai Selassie, Xioaolu, and Nadifa Muhammad from the Granta list. I now very briefly just like to introduce our distinguished panel of writers. First of all, Chandrahas Chaudhury will be the moderator. Then we have well-known Jhumpa Lahiri, Jonathan Franzen, Crace, Maaza Mengiste, Xioaolu, and over to you, I think, at this stage. I will leave the stage of this and leave it to the writers who will have a very interesting discussion, I'm sure. I wish you all well for this morning's session. It's great to have you on this session with us. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. I think my first task of the morning is to detain you long enough so you don't leave while everyone's being mic'd up. So I'm going to say my little piece before. Ajala, are you mic'd? Okay. Well, what we've gathered this morning to discuss is in some ways a very old thing, and in some other ways a very new thing. And I think it's our task in an hour this morning to figure out all the distinctions between these categories. I think the novel has been global ever since it began, so it's not at all a new fact that the novel has global ambition. From the very beginning, writers from any one country who worked in novel form looked to other countries. It was global insofar as people had a global vision. You looked as far as you could to find what other people were doing with the form, where other people were drawing their inspirations from. And it was global again for the reader in that as readers from any one tradition, we looked to other traditions to see what other novelists were doing. And one would imagine that when the boundaries on this kind of writing and this kind of reception were taken away, when writing was more unfettered, the result would be unambiguously a better thing. But as with all things human, when there are certain gains, you also have certain losses. And I think some of us today might be singing songs of praise, some others might be singing elegies when we think about what is it with the novel today when you can have a book out that in different countries at the same time and have millions of people being able to read in the same day, almost as if we're watching a movie. And what we gain from, for instance, digital media and the e-book and and I suppose we might also ask if is fiction after all is not a corporation and it doesn't benefit from being scaled up like McDonald's into something global. Do we lose something when we think about fiction as a global form? Xioaolu, I think I'm going to begin with you by asking you.
Okay. Okay.
You're the only one here amongst us who writes in more than one language, and Chinese for you has a very specific range, and you have a specific audience, but you've also now written your last 3 novels in English. In some ways, your journey is a very 21st century journey of going through the layers from nation to globe. And maybe you have something to say about what global writing or global literature means to you, both in a personal context and more generally.
I guess am I audible? No.
Yes, now.
Okay. I guess my case is very familiar to you because we live everywhere or nowhere at the same time, and especially our children will grow up in Delhi and then live in New York and then move to Tokyo. So they might have many passports and they might speak many languages. So in my case, when I lived in China, I write all my novels in Chinese. Now I live in the UK, so I wrote all my novels in English. And then last year, I live in Berlin, and I was studying Germany. I said, well, I could never really write a German novel, so I give up. So now I'm only a bilingual novelist. But I'm saying that I think it's not too unique. I think it's quite a typical case. You live in a space, you try to communicate with audience and readers in that country, and you really have to make effort to speak their language. And in my case, I learned English when I moved to UK 10 years ago. And I write my novel in broken English. Still, it's very broken English. It's not only a way of survival, but also it's a play of identity. Because in my case, I think Chinese is always a very big identity. It's kind of unescapable. It's too heavy. Also, the ideological, the communism background, I think is very heavy. So when I write in English, I felt free in terms of censorship. And what I mean is a self-censorship. Because if you live in China, you need to be very careful certain things. You need to play around in order to live as artist, otherwise you're in prison. So I found this freedom and this double identity, which is really quite liberating. So it's not only a way of thinking about communication or market. It's somehow an artist to try to live in a different dimension and different culture, yeah.
Jonathan, I know you don't need to look so shocked, you are on this panel after all. I know that you've thought a lot about this matter because in a sense you are in a different place from Xioaolu, and you're an American writer who now has a world audience but has thought a lot about these persistently over 10, 15 years in your essays, and sometimes in your fiction about what it means to live in a global world. Do you have any thoughts to begin?
Yeah, well, I guess I write from, I was born into the center of the great colonial power of my era. Sorry, I'm going to find the mic. I was born into this at the center of the great colonial power of my era, and so certain questions of identity and concern about the rest of the world didn't necessarily apply in the Midwest of the United States in 1959. There was just America, and what's been odd, speaking about now as opposed to the beginnings of the novel, what's been odd is in my lifetime, so much of American culture has been exported in the form of technology, in the form of television, in the form of a consumer way of life, that things that I'm writing about purely from up close start having this weird applicability very far away. The consumer culture I'm writing about might not have been familiar in India even 25 years ago, but now you say, oh yeah, the mall, and the sneakers, all of that stuff has suddenly been exported. So there's no real point to that statement, but just you called on me with the question. Maybe you can come back for some deep thoughts about the history of the novel and how television relates to all of this.
Okay, so I will just wait 5 or 10 minutes so everyone forgets when I ask it again, then you think I asked it. Jhumpa, I meant to ask you, might one say that even if one's a regional writer, one's always a global reader, and so in some sense this distinction breaks down when we think of ourselves as writers, because none of us are formed by any one tradition. And what does the tradition mean in your case, and how do you think of yourself as is global for you is a private or a public category in your own work?
Well, I think from the, sorry, that might have been my phone ringing. And I think that we might want to distinguish between the word global, which to me seems almost at this point a commercial term, right, for marketing literature, and the word universal, which is a more aesthetic question, which I think art has always, which is what art always strives to do, is to be universal. In spite of its limitation and its specificity. And I think that's what we as writers, as artists, want to do, is to try to transcend the barrier of ourselves and what makes us specific and unique and therefore limited as people, and to write something, to express something that can reach others in spite of who they are. And so I think that's certainly why I read literature, why I became a passionate reader, and therefore I assume a writer, like all of us. I mean, I think to start I can just contribute sort of where I am coming from in all of this, is that I mean, in a way my whole upbringing was very global in that sense. Though the term wasn't used back then. I think it's a very recent way of defining things, culture, novels, what have you. But I was raised in the United States by Indian parents who were constantly turning back to India for their center of gravity. And I was raised speaking another language. So I had to learn English as a child. So therefore I started writing in English, reading in English, writing in English. But I'm constantly having to incorporate a certain other language, other reality into my work from the very beginning. So I do understand, I mean, for me it's almost, I suppose, something because I've lived with all my life, I sort of take it for granted. That is what I know. What I know is confusion. What I know is juxtaposition. What I know is the seemingly irreconcilable differences and things that can wedge us apart, and yet a sort of constant attempt, in spite of those difficulties, to bridge gaps. I think that's what I learned as a child. That's what I saw my parents doing, and that has informed me as a person, and I think has certainly informed my work until now.
Maaza, I have a question for you. it seems to me that global is the kind of word that it's such a high word that it drags all other things up with it, and sometimes it leaves you very unrooted. And I know, for instance, that sometimes you just thought of as an African writer, whether or not you like that. But even if that were true, that would leave out so many other things about your work and about your identity, your history, and for instance, your style or your technique. Is this at all a useful category to put you in, and or what would you prefer?
You know, I really actually like this term that Jhumpa said in terms of, it's not necessarily global, but I'm writing about, maybe in my first book, specifically Ethiopian characters, but the emotions that they feel and the experiences that they have, and the conflict that exists between families and husbands and wives and brothers and father and son is itself a very human condition. So my characters might be situated in Ethiopia because that's where I was born, and I can work with that experience for this book. But again, I think the gift or the challenge that I have set myself as a writer is to use my experience and not get stuck in it, but to work through it and continue to expand. So when someone says, may label me an African writer, I was born in Africa. If you set me in Kenya and someone says, who are you? I say, I am Ethiopian. If you set me in New York and someone says, what are you? I'll say, I'm Ethiopian American. If you set me in Ethiopia and someone says, you're American, and I'll say, yes, I am. So but I work through those experiences towards something that's universal. I'm remembering, there's a story that's very famous in Ethiopia. We had a revolution that began in 1974. So if you can imagine what's happening right now in Egypt and Syria, we went through it in 74. And there was a young student, an English literature major, who was imprisoned in one of the most notorious prisons with a lot of other revolutionaries, and it was quite a horrendous place. Somehow, someone smuggled him a copy of Gone with the Wind. And after these interrogation sessions that he had, he would find scraps of paper, and he sustained himself and he sustained the other prisoners in his cell by translating on these scraps of cigarette paper or any paper he could find, translating chapter by chapter Gone with the Wind. He was there for many years. So he finished that book, but he would read Gone with the Wind to the prisoners. And to me, Margaret Mitchell, I may have as an American and as a black in America my own issues with this book, but I imagine a group of prisoners sitting around as someone is reading Scarlett O'Hara saying, as God is my witness, I will survive. And we're talking about something that's universal here in literature that transcends other things that I may put on this book. So maybe we're not necessarily talking about global literature, but we're talking about global or international readers. Maybe it's the readers that make a book global. I wouldn't call Margaret Mitchell a global writer, but she traveled to Ethiopia.
Jim, I'm sorry if being on this panel so far has been for you a bit like being goalkeeper of Chelsea. You've been waiting a long time for a shot and it just hasn't arrived. But I have a question for you. When we say global, we kind of think of it mainly as a spatial category in that something's happening at the same time all over the world. But I'm going to ask you if maybe we might also think of it as a temporal category, and being a global writer in the 21st century and in the work of yourself or David Mitchell, for instance, means being able to have the ambition to go back in time and try and think of humanity as something inexpressibly strange, which is what you do in Harvest. Was that part of your intention in writing that book?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm thrilled to be described as a goalkeeper. I'm the shortest goalkeeper in the history of football and literature. Where the global novel is concerned, I have to tell you that when I'm asked questions of this kind, I always feel a bit of a buffoon, because as a writer, I don't really introspect or feel like I'm inhabiting literary categories or literary theories. I don't even think of the reader. For me, it's kind of like a private act that becomes embarrassingly public when my books are published. But as a writer, as a reader, I think I'm very clear what the global novel can mean. For me, when I think, there are certain novels every few years that are written by someone that's not English, someone from somewhere else in the world, which become a worldwide phenomenon, and which then colour your impression of what that country is like, something you will never forget. For example, I remember reading Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which transformed my understanding of what it was like to be an African and what the colonization meant to African from an African point of view. There are other books. For example, I remember when I was a teenager reading Narayan, who was widely translated throughout the world and became a global phenomenon. Then there was the South American writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So for me, that's what a global novel is. It's a novel which captures the imagination of more than the nation in which it was written. And through translation and through other publishing houses, gets sent around the world and forever changes our understanding of the country in which that novel is set. I don't feel I've written one of those novels yet, but I'm very, very grateful to those people that have provided me with those novels in the past. So you've now got a reading list. If you've not read any of those three writers, then you must go away and read them straight away.
But isn't part of what's happening with globalization and the kind of mobility you're talking about that every place is getting more and more alike, and that the worst way to be universal as a writer, it seems to me, is to seek to be universal. You're concerned, oh, well, the world is bigger than France, therefore I'm going to write a book that has characters from every other continent. You're actually probably going to get farther from universality than if you talk about your next door neighbor in Paris. But the scary thing to me is the kind of homogenization of global culture. And yes, obviously that global monoculture will continue to have a particular national character in various parts of the world, but that kind of experience Jim was talking about of, wow, Achebe has shown me something about Africa. Africa may be more resistant, by the way, to the global monoculture than many other parts of the world, but my worry as a reader is that it becomes almost a nostalgic experience, the very idea of cultural difference.
I agree. I think there's also a very tricky bit, language as a passport.
Yes.
So all of us write in English, and I write in Chinese too. But if you write in Japanese or Vietnamese or Portuguese, you have to wait for the long waiting list to be translated. And translated literature never really work immediately somehow as the native, the English literature, unless you won Nobel Prize or some big prize. Then there's a fast kind of marketing force to deliver that foreign language book. And I know that very well when I write in Chinese. When my novel's being translated, it's never really kind of communicate very well at all in the world. So in a way, like it's the easy and the laziest way is to write in English. But on the other hand, what a struggle try to write other than English, any other language. So this is a battle, and I often find myself speak much louder in an English-speaking world because I know that somehow the certain Chinese language novel doesn't come across really, you don't really know much, or there's a certain huge naivety towards other culture. And I'm saying language is a passport, as dubious, dangerous passport too.
I would like to pick up on some of these things also. I mean, I agree that translation really that's the key. That's what has made these books, that is the bridge for so many of us to be able to read across our limitation. Again, I think it really is, we work out of our limitations, as I say, as people, as artists. We know what we know, and we know our next door neighbor. We don't know these big things. However, I think the great books that endure do communicate something that is, that is comprehensible and resonant, and in some sense transcends these limitations. But I do think that translation continues to be the force that creates a truly global readership. Now, what is happening now with the sort of the Anglophone world, for better or for worse, has a certain power, I think, that is distressing in a lot of ways. I live in Italy now, and I was very struck a couple of weeks ago. I was looking at La Repubblica's, they had the 10 best books of the year according to the editors of La Repubblica. They chose 7 books written in English. This was astonishing to me. Having been raised in America, I cannot imagine the New York Times ever choosing 7 books written in a language other than English as their choices. So I do think that the focus on English is distressing in that sense, because it has a certain power and a certain readership and a certain commercial, currency now. Because there's so much literature that is that needs to be brought forward, and the danger now is that it's getting even less exposure. And I think that's one of the downsides of this idea of a global novel. I experienced this year for the first time, I had a book published in the fall, and for the first time it was published simultaneously in India, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and the various territories, because of this issue with e-books and electronic, things. My publishers could explain more articulately than I, but I was struck that this is now the new way of things, because usually the book would come out in America, and then maybe 4 months later it would come out in England, and then it was more staggered. But it still only applies to English. There's so many other territories, other worlds, other languages for a book to be translated into and to be read in. And I think, one has to understand and respect the power of a specific language, which is still a very real thing in the world. No matter how, quickly a book can go out into the world now. You can write it and then you can hit a button and it seems to go out there, but it's really not the case for the translator who takes that manuscript and renders it into his or her own language. It's a very powerful restriction, a specific language, and I think it has to be respected as such. Because there is no universal language.
Not enough.
It doesn't exist. There's no matter what we can do to bring people together and have malls and sneakers and some sort of culture that seems to, span the globe, language remains something that defines and restricts us. There are only a few languages I can read in. I just can't do it in other languages, and that's the case for most of us as human beings.
But maybe I just add a little bit. But I think our reading habit is being stolen and changed, very mainstreamized. For example, I think Eastern Asian literature, less narrative, much less narrative, more like a mind voyage. But our reading habit is more like Anglo-Saxon American word, yeah? So it's quite a realism. It's very realism. It's very narrative driven. And I think I remember when I grew up, reading Chinese literature is so non-narrative. I love your work, Jonathan, but in a way, but then when you are smelled by the English American literature, and I wonder, my favorite literature was sometimes like Fernando Pessoa, Portuguese, Calvino, French, and I was never really into American literature. But nowadays, all this narrative very similar. It's so realism, so storytelling driven. It's so less poetry in it. And as if all the poetry, all the alternative things being pushed away by mainstream society. I'm talking about the mainstream media. I'm not talking about little art house, little bookshop try to struggle to survive, selling little Fernando Pessoa book. So our reading habit is totally being transformed by the mainstream, like Hollywood. Hollywood even stealing, Korean. So Korean cinema look like Hollywood film. Chinese cinema look like Hollywood film. The alternative needs to be much more powerful, much more money to put in to raise that platform. And then you can read in an equal platform without such unequal competition. And I think certain American literature is overrated, massively overrated, and I really hate to read them, and I never read them anyway. So that's my point. Okay.
It's just wonderful that we have a panel of free speakers here and that you can hear all kinds of points of view. I will see what you say, Xioaolu, because I've heard you also say that it's a kind of strange burden that we carry when we don't live in the West, that we have to know the Western tradition and our own, but when we go out to some other place, it doesn't appear that the reverse is also the case. I mean, I know that you said somewhere that everybody in China knows Charles Bukowski, but it's not. No poetry reader in America knows a lot of contemporary Chinese poets. But Jhumpa, from what you were saying, it seemed to me that there's this tension here where we both kind of agree that in order to fulfill our responsibilities as readers in the 21st century, we have to read much more, as much as possible in translation, because these are the freedoms that are newly available to us. I remember when as a child, my whole world as an English reader was an Anglophone one. It was American, British literature, and some Russian classics. So it seems to me that you're saying that we've got to read as widely as possible, but also when we read works in translation, sometimes somebody's done the difficult work for us of understanding another culture, and we are right at the tag end of it, and it's not clear that the power is on the side of the writer, the power is on the side of the reader to choose something, and the genuinely difficult books, the genuinely strange books are the ones that get left out in this race.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, they are there. You can go and read Fernando Pessoa, who's an amazing writer. The power should always be in the hands of the reader. I'm not interested in power as a writer, but as a reader, I'm interested in my freedom to read as widely and as deeply as I can. And so I'm grateful to publishers, but moreover to translators to get access to those books. I have not read anything in English for almost 2 years. I've decided just to read in Italian. So I've been exploring and furthering my education of Italian literature, which was very superficial before I moved there. And it's an extraordinarily freeing thing to do, coming from, a life led in the United States and an English education, and my reading, as yours, was entirely Anglophone, and it is freeing because you see beyond, and I think coming from America, where again, the New York Times would never choose 7 out of the 10 best books of the year written in a language other than English, and to give that sort of recognition to an author who's not American is really inconceivable. But other countries clearly think differently, and I don't want to judge either place, but it is interesting to think. I do think that it is shameful, the lack of translation, the lack of energy put into translation in the American market. I can say that. I suppose that is a judgment, but I can make it. I will make it, and it's embarrassing to me. And I think just getting out of America for a little while makes you much more conscious of that. But that's where I think the power should lie, is always with the reader, and I think it's up to smart editors, and again, to the hard work, the backbreaking work of translation, to get those books, to render them into different languages, and then to have them available to readers. But the way that books are discovered rediscovered over time. I mean, those are things we can't really control, no matter how hard publishers work to, you know, to do that. Sometimes things happen by chance. Sometimes a writer will, you know, work very hard to get a book more exposure, and often that can happen as well. Someone can translate a book and retranslate a book. Lots of things can happen to introduce books, different kinds of books, to the global market.
But the one of the consequences of globalism, it seems to me, and I think we see this even in the literary world, is that things become less horizontal and more vertical. You have, if you can imagine everything perfectly translated, we have massive subsidy for translations, and anyone who's publishing in Romanian, and people are reading in Romania, that is instantly available in all languages everywhere. You still are faced with the finite amount of reading time that an individual reader has, and there's, in just the same way that everyone has a Samsung product or an Apple product, in a funny way, you'd think that there would be greater diversity in what is read, but I worry that the trend in a more global literary marketplace is even more toward a kind of star system, and then a vast sea of people who can't find an audience. That and one of the good things about a self-limited literary community, one working within a language, its own language, readers looking to the writers writing in that language, is that it is substantially immune to those verticalizing commercial pressures.
I have to say, I do find it quite hard to feel too anxious about these issues. Because in the end, what have we got? First of all, the impulse to write. And the impulse to write is very personal. It's not really all that affected by trends and by the publishing industry or other pressures. When it comes down to it, you can only sing in your own voice. And if someone wants to write a conventional novel, then they will do. If someone wants to do something more poetic and experimental and challenging, then that will happen. Nor am I particularly worried about the next stage, that those writers will have an outlet. Because particularly with the internet and web publishing, there are more and more opportunities, not fewer opportunities, for writers to disseminate their work and for that work to travel across the globe in a split second. If I have a worry at all, I think, it's the worry of, as several of my colleagues on the stage have said, of the power of the English language. Recently I was in Malta, that very overcrowded small island in the Mediterranean, where they have a language which is largely Arabic-based, but with some influences of Italian and some influences of the English, of course. I met there with a group of young writers, all in their late teens, early 20s, about 20 or 30 of them, all of whom had the same ambitions that any writer born with the good fortune to speak English as a first language and living in the big, powerful publishing worlds of England and America would have. They all had those same ambitions. However, not a single one of those writers wanted to write in Maltese. So when I said to them, this is a tragedy, this beautiful language, which could easily atrophy and rot away unless you defend it, why aren't you writing in that language? They said, you must be crazy. That's professional suicide to write in that language. Because if I'm published in that language, only Maltese can read it, and only the Maltese who will read it will, that's a small percentage of a small number of people. We have to write in English. So, in principle, you think, well, why shouldn't they? But when you heard them express themselves, you could feel a certain hesitancy in their own expression of English. And these were all very intelligent people that spoke, for most purposes, really good English. However, you found that when they were trying to nuance certain ideas, they had to, their vocabulary, their thesaurus of words was smaller than mine, for example. Why wouldn't it be? English was their second language. You could feel that they stuttered for the right word now and again and had to fall back to their own language, Maltese, to express themselves adequately. So you're thinking, here are people that want to write great novels and probably have great novels in them that are using a language which is kind of behind a screen for them, and they're going to underexpress themselves. So, I mean, the major thing about that is not that some Maltese people can't publish their novels. The major worry is that the Maltese language itself and all those other languages throughout the world are going to disappear under the great boulder of English. But also it is a concern that those writers can't express themselves, because it is through writing that language becomes vivid and rarefied and valuable. And so I can't be concerned about most things that have been said today, but that is something that really does worry me.
Well, Jim, I heard you say later that you had read Narayan and Achebe, and you thought that a global novel was something that had a connection with readers all across the world. But I meant to ask you, there's a sense we all have as writers and as very close readers that in the end the great books win through, and the time sifts the good from the bad, and we all end up reading the best writers. But is that really the case? And I also want to ask this to you, Jonathan, because a lot of your work is about the effects of capitalism on human minds, and this idea that we believe that a choice that we believe we made a choice, but actually it's somebody else making a kind of choice for us. And I meant to ask you guys, if isn't this, even if we are talking in terms of global literature, aren't the arbiters of what is and what is not global still mainly coming out of a couple of metropolitan centers?
Well, all I can say is that how can we tell whether we're reading the best books? All that you need to worry about as readers is that there are great books to read, and there are, aren't there? There are some great books to read, and we're never going to read them all. I mean, just go into any bookshop and you feel terrified at all the novels you're never going to read, even if you live to be 100. So that's the main concern. Of course, there are going to be some great writers that don't bubble to the top, but I wouldn't worry too much about them. Writing is a very narcissistic activity anyway, and if some people are spared that narcissism, then that's probably just as well. The important thing is there are great books around. There always will be great books around. You can change the publishing industry and make it not resemble what it was 20 years ago. But don't worry about that, because narrative is strong. Narrative itself will never die. Whatever the form of publication and dissemination, storytelling is stronger than anything.
Maaza, your thoughts?
Well, I think I tend to be a little bit more hopeful in terms of what is the state of quote-unquote global literature. And maybe it's because I'm very aware of migration and what's happening right now as entire groups of people are moving from one country to another. And I think I'm reading stories now. I made it a goal this year to try to only read now things in translation. And I've been specifically looking for writers writing about Ethiopia. Ethiopia has over 200 distinct languages. And not all of them are written down, but there are several that have. And of course, I have to look for English translation because I can't read all of those languages. But what struck me is, again, you can't think of today, I mean, without thinking of migration, without thinking of Lampedusa, without thinking of what's happening to the refugees coming from Syria. Those stories have yet to be written. And as I've done research in Ethiopia, suddenly the world, my country, that I thought I knew, has expanded in dimension, because now I'm finding writers writing in Arabic, Yemeni, writing about the Yemeni community in Ethiopia, and Iraqi Ethiopians, Armenian Ethiopians, Greek Ethiopians. These stories are being written. They are not always, the translation is very slow. I'm finding these literally by talking to people, calling up academics who are translators or who work in those regions. But I am finding them. So it seems I have maybe perhaps a limited perspective, but I do have faith that these stories are coming up. When my cousin, who went from Ethiopia, moved to Russia, speaks fluent Russian, moves to Bulgaria, and is now in Texas and is becoming a filmmaker, that's global or maybe universal, and his story is going to combine all of these elements. And I have faith that the cab driver that I get into a cab in New York, who tells me that he has relatives in all these other different countries, the stories are going to be coming from there. Maybe we have to wait a generation, maybe we have to wait a little bit, but I don't think things are static. And I don't think that, at least the writers I found are not trying to write for an American audience, at least the ones I found. And that gives me a little bit of hope.
Yeah, I really deeply agree with you somehow. Because sometimes actually it doesn't have to be your bending poetic impulse to express. Sometimes it's nearly like a certain kind of journalism, but much more refined, much more structured journalism. And I'm no shame to say sometimes the literature is lower than journalism nowadays. So much mediocre thing happening in the literature world. But I have really strong sympathy and identification with exiled literature, with migrant literature. Because, for example, lots of artists are from some country, like Iran, China, Russian, exiled in the West, or from Eastern Europe. In the early stage, we talk about Milan Kundera, but now we talk about something else. Large quantity of politically exiled people live outside of their country, and their voice is very strong. And sometimes I try to be their voice, and I think I'm one of them. First, to have voice. Second, talk about your idea. Therefore, you choose certain language which is much more powerful. Perhaps it's English. Maybe next century is Chinese, but we don't know. But at the moment, you choose English so you can have voice to speak about some kind of completely ignorant, completely been repressed culture, which I think I am in that kind of platform. Then you talk about your idea. So I don't have this self-comfort, self-congratulating attitude towards writing is mere beautiful self-narcissistic expression. No, I'm burned by some anger. And I think that's the same way I make all the films, documentary films, rather documentary than fiction. Because so many stuff going on, you need to completely just to immediate capture them without going through the process to beautify them. Because actually the world needs that. And I'm not talking about cheap journalism or cheap literature. I think it's just a writer from such a different suppression and background, and they have their way to deliver what they want to write, yeah.
Jhumpa, you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I still feel a little bit uncomfortable, I suppose, about this word global. And I'm sorry to bring this up again, but I agree with you, Maaza. I understand so well these ideas of migration and people moving around and how this is a force that has changed literature, and I'm certainly a product of that in my own way. I haven't moved around that much around the world as your cousin has, but this is a fact. But people have historically always been moving around the world, and that is a fact. We know this from prehistoric times. People are moving, migrating, settling, resettling all over the place. But I, in terms of the global novel, I don't know if it's an ideal, because, again, I mean, a writer has to be true to him or herself, period. That's it. And they have to write what they need to write without any concern for what it's going to mean in the larger context. And so I think, there's this idea of a global culture, global economy, global, you get on an airplane and in 8 hours you can be basically anywhere and get a Starbucks coffee. And that is just what it is. And you can lament that or you can be excited by that, depending on who you are and what kind of life you've led. But, Alice Munro is a global writer. And she writes out of a very specific experience. She's not your cousin, but it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. What the writer has done or lived in that sense is irrelevant to the writer's vision And that can be created by a writer living in one town for his or her whole life and never moving out of it. And it can be done by your cousin or a different kind of citizen of the world. But I think the writer's craft work it shouldn't be confused, I suppose, by this term of globality, which I do think still remains a sort of commercial concept, to me anyway.
Okay, Jonathan, I was going to ask you a very complicated question about the novel and technology, but we've run out of time. And we're going to get questions from the audience. Somebody from the front row, and then we'll also go back. The lady in the second row, please.
Yes, thank you, Chandrahas. Quick comment, is it deliberate that the panel, people who have this multi-layered, multilingual, multicultural experience are women, and the two monocultural, monolingual are men, but I'm not sure. Anyway, just a comment. A question was to you. Talking about translation and and one's embedding and coming out of the great books and big literature, which is generally Anglophone. How did you access the translations, Zhu, if I pronounce your name correctly, to the kind of platform of great books that the others were referring to?
To us?
Yeah.
I think it might be to you specifically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for raising that question. First, I think translator has no power whatsoever. The power is in the industry. The book industry decide who they want to translate, what kind of book can sell in the translated word, yeah? I have no illusion a translator can pick a book and say, I'm going to do beautiful translation. No way. Most of the translators being commissioned by a powerful industry, which perhaps, biggest corporation we all embedded in. And then she has 2 months or 3 months. And I write a book, every 5 years I will write a book. The translation will be done in very limited time, very, very small money, in the most indecent situation, whatever, translating fast. And the wife or the husband will try to help a bit. It's completely impersonal. And the literature is such a painful process for the writer. So this is completely industrialized market. I never have any trust on that. When I read the translated literature from the Western language to Chinese, unreadable. 99% is unreadable. So this is the question throw back to the industry, which is a power center. So what the power is thinking is money. So that's what related to my speech about our reading habit is being stolen. And our translated word is extremely selected, not by the beauty of literature, but by certain power, which is capitalism.
Somebody from the back? Anybody wants to ask a question? Right at the back there. Yes, you, ma'am. There'll be a mic coming across. Okay, why don't we take...
Okay, got it.
Yes.
My question is for Mrs. Mengiste. I'm currently living in Ethiopia. I'm teaching English there. My students love poetry, and they love telling stories. But there's really no avenue to circulate that, even in Amharic or Afan-Oromo. So, given the constraints and the push from the publishing industry that we see in a global market, my question for you is, what is your dream for the publishing industry in developing countries? Like in Ethiopia, how would you like to see markets grow and develop in a way that gives voice to smaller places? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're asking me what is it that I would like to see in Ethiopia in the publishing industry? Well, Ethiopia historically has been a closed society. We've had 5 years of occupation with Italy and no other experience with colonialism. I mean, one of the things is, so it's been, Ethiopians read the Bible. Literature is mainly in the form of poetry. Poetry that rhymes. And there's still a sense of needing to push the definitions of what poetry is, what literature is. Literature doesn't have to be didactic. It doesn't have to solely entertain. It could be serious. So you ask a very broad question. I'm not sure what my dream would be, but I will tell you that, that one of the most heartening things in Ethiopia for me, and with literature, has been seeing there are bookstores in Ethiopia, but books are very expensive. It's cost prohibitive to get a book because the cost of printing is so expensive. But what happens is anytime you are driving in your car and you are at a stop sign or you're stopped, your car will be mobbed by 3 or 4 kids, and they are carrying books stacked high. And they say, what do you want? What title do you want? And they go from car to car. That's the bookstore in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. And I've been terrified sometimes I'll find my book. But this is the way that literature is literally on foot with these kids. And I'll ask them, do you have this book? And they'll say, hold on, ma'am. And they'll run to wherever they go, and they'll bring me this book. This is what happens in nations that are still developing, where literature and reading is still something that needs to grow. What's my dream? I wish those little boys luck. And it's a broad question.
Okay. Someone from the front again? Yeah, you.
I can try to project.
No, there's a mic coming for you.
Hi. So I'm going to ask this question from the viewpoint of a parent bringing up kids back in the US. How can you reflect as a child feeling richer and or poorer in terms of your experience, and how did that frame you to be a better writer in terms of growing as a minority in an Anglo-Saxon world?
Okay, so how does the experience make you richer?
Or being from an ethnic diaspora out in the U.S. as a child's group?
As a child, you know, I found my community in books. I didn't feel like I was a minority necessarily. When I first came to the U.S. and I'd love to hear I was struggling with English, so I had to, and I was looking for books of children like me who came from another country and were just trying to make it, in a sense, in the U.S. in the school system. I couldn't find books about Ethiopia, but I could read books from China. Charlotte's Web was one of my favorites. I could pick up, all these books, Alice in Wonderland, and I found my heroes through literature, and they didn't have to look like me, but I could feel or connect with them in some way. It makes the world a lot less lonely. It's not what you look like. It's what you feel when you're reading a book.
Well, I'm afraid that's all that we have time for today, but all the writers will be signing their books afterwards in front of the shop. So if you have questions for them, maybe